Hello and welcome to this first video in our lecture on user authentication with passwords and biometrics. Since we've reached kind of an articulation point in our security course, I thought it would be a good idea to take a step back and look at the big picture for this course. Remember that the four domains of computer security are policy, mechanisms, assurance, and human factors. And we've been spending a few weeks talking about one particular kind of mechanism called cryptographic primitives. So while we're still going to be using and mentioning crypto as we move forward, we're going to start considering other mechanisms from now on. So also remember the goals of computer security, the CIAAA goals. Make sure to remember what these stand for, as well as which one of these goals are supported by cryptographic primitives that we've discussed so far. So in starting with this lecture, we're going to discuss another topic of computer security, which is access control. So obviously, one of the goals of security is to protect assets, be they information or computer systems, etc., and protect them from attacks. And so, in particular, a general approach to protecting such assets is to control who has access to them. Um, so, this term of access control actually has several meanings, but for us, it's going to be a general term about controlling the access to uh, computer assets or assets that some have to do with computer security. So access control always start out with some administrative policies and procedures. So these policies are first put in place. They basically prescribe what information or computer services can be accessed and by whom and under what circumstances. And then once the policies have been established, then we put in place mechanisms um, to implement those policies. So these mechanisms have to be designed, configured, implemented, and then they have to be used and enforced. So remember, other names for mechanisms include controls or countermeasures, and cryptographic primitives are one such kind of mechanisms. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about passwords and a little bit about biometrics. And then the next lecture will also be devoted to biometrics. So in one definition of access control, we have the following definition. So access control is really composed of three steps: the identification step, the authentication step, and the authorization step. And it's important for you to keep those terms straight. So the identification step is the step through which a user is stating their identity. So in an analogy, it's like someone knocking at the door and saying, "Hey, I'm John, let me in." So you're just stating who your identity is. Another analogy would be when you type in your user ID, you're claiming to be that user. The second step of access control is the authentication step. This is the act of verifying that this claim of identity is actually true. So this is how you actually prove that you have the identity you claim to have. So for example, at the door, maybe someone is looking through the peephole and trying to recognize you, or in a case of a computer system, you're typing in a password. Since the password is supposed to be only known by a given user, then that's a way of authenticating the user, proving that they are who they say they are. And then the third step in access control is authorization. So we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. But basically, this step is that of giving access rights to the user after they have been authenticated. So, in summary, first you have to identify yourself, then you have to prove that you are who you say you are, and once you have done that, you are given some rights to access some information. So you may be authorized to read a file or modify another file. These are the authorization steps. So, one thing to note is that this terminology is not always used uniformly. So, in many books, for example, some of the books I've used to prepare for this class, the term access control refers to the third step of authorization. But more generally, I'd like you to think about authorization as this three-step process. And in this lecture, we're going to focus on the authentication step. And then later on in the course, we will talk about the authorization step. Now, since we're talking about authentication, starting on the next slide, I want you to make sure you remember which one of these A's stands for authentication. And I want to make a little bit clarification here. So we have been talking about authentication a lot when we were talking about cryptographic primitives. And this was essentially message authentication. Remember, in that context, message authentication meant two things. One, make sure that the integrity of the message was preserved, and two, ensuring that the sender of the message or the owner of a file was who they say they are. So this was, we call that authentication so far, or maybe message authentication. And so this is to be distinguished from user authentication, which is what we're talking about now in the context of access control. So now it's a little bit more broad. We're not just talking about, say, information flying through a network being authenticated. We're talking about authentication of users of any computer system, be it a workstation or a mainframe or any kind of information system. So let's talk a little bit more about authentication in general, or user authentication. So again, remember that this is the second step in the process of access control. It's the step of verifying that a claimed identity is an actual identity. So what is the outcome of this authentication step? Well, it's a binary outcome. Either the person is authenticated or they are not. Or I said the person, but the user in general. It could be a process rather than a person. So in the case that the identity is verified, and so the user is authenticated, then the next step kicks in, which is the authorization. Is that person allowed to come in through the door, or are they allowed to access this file or that file, and under what conditions, to do what operations on it, and so on and so forth. So what kind of information is used for user authentication? Well, the standard taxonomy of authentication techniques are something you know, something you have, something you are, and something you do. So something you know is basically authenticating yourself through your knowledge. So you have to enter a password that only you are supposed to know, or you use a PIN, or you answer a security question like your mother's maiden name. So this is something that you know. Then there is something that you have. So this is something you possess. For example, a physical token, an artifact like a driver's license or swipe card or smart card, key fob, etc., etc. So this is something that you physically own, an object. Then there is something you are. So this is literally, say, a body part, like your fingerprints, your retina scan, your iris scan. So this is clearly a way to identify or to authenticate you, as long as you're using something that's unique to each person. And then finally, there is something you do. So these are your actions or your behaviors. So for example, a handwritten signature, a pattern in your vocal cords or a voice print, and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about these in upcoming lectures, and maybe even starting at the end of this lecture. But in this lecture, we're going to focus on passwords.